going to start with thank you again for coming along to session 4 now of Go Look Yourself. Hoping you're able to continue with it as much as possible. The fact that you are here today is also a very good sign of that, and hopefully people, again, watching online. In terms of a reminder, a bit of a recap of where we're up to. The story so far, just a reminder, because it's important to remind ourselves of where we've come to. And also part of today's session is building again upon what we've covered so far. At the very beginning, we talked about embracing luck. Do you feel as though, this is just something for you to reflect upon, that you are perhaps now embracing luck a little bit more, recognising that? We'll talk a bit more about that in a second. Have you started to develop a good luck mindset, which is what I'm calling it? And the two key aspects of that I focused on were gratitude, finding ways to be grateful for things. Could be small things, little things that happen each day. Some of the research suggests just thinking of 3 good things that happen that day could be an important part of that. Maybe once a week thinking of some other things as well. It's up to you how you want to do that. And also part of that was trying to cultivate an optimistic outlook, gently expecting things to work out in your favour or to work out for the best. And we looked at different ways in which you might be able to do that. Then in session 3, talked about different ways of perhaps first of all noticing those opportunities which may be around us and even creating some of those opportunities. A key part of the noticing opportunities was this developing a mindful approach, something I'll talk about again in this session, as I see that's potentially a key part of going with the flow. It's how we can be more mindful. And in terms of creating opportunities, things that we can do to perhaps create those kinds of opportunities. I've encapsulated here in terms of doing something different. I talked about developing those weak ties, those people you don't know so well, but you often see around the place. Are the ways in which you can develop those kinds of weak ties, because perhaps they're the people who will have those offers, those opportunities that we might describe as luck experiences. Pushing yourself outside of your comfort zone, perhaps striking up a conversation with someone you wouldn't normally do. Anybody tried this? Whilst keeping it safe, obviously not taking unnecessary risks. Or just changing your routine in some way. So I like to sort of, not necessarily now verbally, but in your luck journals or at any point tell me if you've been trying to do this. If not, continuing, reminding you to the things that we've encountered so far. So that's what we've looked at so far. The constant reminders, DPhil, just a little sort of in-joke to myself as a hashtag. Don't forget your luck journal. Don't worry if it's something you have forgotten about. Then, the mindfulness approach is saying, well, a gentle reminder that spot where it is and seeing if you can note something in there. Don't berate yourself for not doing it. There's reasons why you're not doing it. And this is helpful to me to know if it is something, you find that you don't do. But if you've left it for a few weeks, feel free to come back to it, talking about any of those things so far and talking about maybe what we're looking at in session 4. So it's the luck journal is going to be a source of data for me, a source of reflection for you. So session 4, I'm calling Go with the Flow. And largely because I think that the notion of going with the flow has had a bit of bad press. This idea that when people simply go with the flow, then that's often taken to be that people are being passive, they're lazy, they're not really trying, they're not doing the things they should be doing. And I'm going to perhaps challenge that a little bit and still use that as a way of thinking about the ideas I want to talk to you about today. The reason why I wanted to remind ourselves of the things that we've encountered so far in the first 3 sessions is that it may well be, it's already becoming somewhat a natural consequence of some of these things so far, of embracing luck, developing a good luck mindset, and particularly perhaps the mindfulness aspect of the opportunity knocks session last time round. So we'll look briefly in a second at how it may be a natural consequence of those things, and then focusing more on this question of, so how much do we control? How much can we control? And there's 2 aspects that have been linked within areas of psychological research And I'll just summarise them very briefly for you in terms of how it can be helpful to us. One is the illusion of control, which is often how we perceive control over situations that we don't actually have. And something that psychologists have called a locus of control, the extent to which we naturally perceive ourselves or something outside of us as being responsible for the things that happen to us. Two things we'll look at. And eventually, this is what I'm getting to, this idea of how we cultivate a balanced approach, and whether or not even mindfulness is a way of getting to there. Does that sound like fun? I won't pause to let you answer that, I shall carry on anyway. So that's the plan for the session today. So, is going with the flow a natural consequence of things that have been happening already? If you have been doing some of these things, then it may well be that you're already starting to be in that frame of mind, which means you're more comfortable to go with the flow. Embracing luck, so going way back now to that first session where I wanted to just get us to recognise how much in our lives, both small events, big events, may be influenced by luck. And part of that is accepting then how much is outside of our control. So the things that happen to us could be from the fact we're being born in the first place, who our parents are, who we happen to sit with at school, the school we go to. So all the way through our education, at least in part, is going to be impacted by things that are outside of our control. Getting our job, getting a first job, any other job, in part, I would argue, is influenced by things that are outside of your control. So whether or not you happen to see an advert in a paper, if that's how you found out about a job, or somebody happened to tell you about an offer, or a friend of a friend. So you'll reflect on different ways in which you might have encountered different workplace opportunities. I would say chunks of that are outside of your control. Meeting people in your life, meeting the person who maybe is or has been a partner, if that's something that applies to you. Reflecting on how that came about. Was that something which was outside of your control? So that to me was part of that first lesson, that first session. The good luck mindset, well, part of that was talking about optimism. And I would argue then that to some extent, how optimistic we choose to be in a situation, in a certain set of circumstances, is within our control. And I was arguing that you could cultivate a more optimistic outlook. And in the context here, is it a small step towards recognising there are some things that we can control? And by even cultivating an optimistic outlook, does it impact upon our behaviour? Does it have this self-fulfilling prophecy so that when we go into a situation expecting it to work out in our favour or for the best, that it impacts how we behave, that can have its own consequence. So to some extent, these are a little bit, not quite contradictory, perhaps complementary, in that something is about recognising what's outside of your control. This is a step towards recognising those things that are within your control. And then the mindful approach that we introduced in session 3 is that one way of helping us to be more aware of what we can and cannot control. So remember that a mindful approach is relating to remembering to be present. So it's helping our awareness of the present moment, not being too caught with what's happening in the future, what's going to happen, and not being too caught up with what's happened in the past. So does that help us to be more aware of what's happening around us, and therefore what we can and can't control? And I pointed you to some mindfulness resources. Now, I would be interested to get a sense of, and I'm very happy for you to be honest, anyone that had a chance to access that in the session itself? Yes, at least one hand's going up and a few nods. I recognise that it's sometimes a challenge to make the time to bring yourself to those places. I encourage you to dip into those. Maybe find one that works for you. There are other ways in which you can just find opportunity to pause and remind yourself to be present. And what I'd like to get is just towards the end of today's session is to dip into another one of those that may help us with this awareness of what we can and can't control. So already, it's possible that you're already starting to cultivate an outlook which means you are more amenable to this idea of going with the flow. Okay, so far. So as I was going through this, I was reminded of something which I think is very relevant here, and it's something you may have come across before, which is this. It's part of the Serenity Prayer, which is written here as though asking God to grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, the courage to change the things that I can, and then the final bit is the kicker, the wisdom to know the difference between the two. So there may be different versions of that, but it's usually encapsulated in the Serenity Prayer. And in this context, it's asking somebody or something more powerful than us to give us the serenity to accept we can't change, the courage to change what we can, and the wisdom to know the difference. Mm-hmm. And I would say there's elements of this is reflected in what I'm talking to you today about. And again, as a psychologist, are there ideas within this that whether or not we see ourselves as religious, whether or not we feel as though we would ask God for this kind of help, are there still ideas within that we can catalyse upon? And I would say there is. So that's something to bear in mind and to remind ourselves of. In relation to this, in terms of then psychological research, there's two elements which I think are worth drawing your attention to. And again, part of this is sort of bringing what we know within psychology to a wider audience, and these are things being researched quite a lot, and then reminding ourselves of why is this relevant to the study of luck and luck experiences.